The real reason for the Peasant Revolt of 1381, economic grievances, political discontent, and social change in late medieval England. The Peasant Revolt of 1381, also known as the Great Rising, stands as one of the most pivotal uprisings in medieval England. Traditionally portrayed as a spontaneous outburst of anger against feudal oppression, the revolt saw thousands of peasants, artisans, and lower-ranking members of society rise up against the government. Historians have often attributed the rebellion to the imposition of a poll tax by the young King Richard II's government. However, a closer examination reveals that the revolt was not simply a reaction to a single tax or a spontaneous explosion of discontent, but rather the culmination of a complex interplay of economic grievances, political discontent, and social changes that had been brewing for decades. The English Peasant Revolt of 1381 was not an isolated incident. Similar revolts occurred across Europe in the late 14th century, reflecting widespread social and economic unrest. In France, the Jacquerie of 1358 saw peasants rise against their lords, while the Ciompi Revolt of 1378 in Florence demonstrated the discontent of lower urban classes. These continental parallels suggest that the Peasant Revolt in England was part of a broader pattern of upheaval during a period of crisis and transition across Europe. England's specific circumstances, however, were shaped by unique factors such as its ongoing war with France, the political power struggles within its ruling elite, and the specific economic and social pressures resulting from the Black Death. Understanding these elements helps clarify why the revolt of 1381 took the shape it did and reveals deeper insights into the evolution of English society during a critical period of transition. Economic grievances, the root of discontent. Economic grievances were at the core of the Peasant Revolt of 1381. The late 14th century was marked by severe economic hardship for many of England's lower classes. The immediate cause of the revolt was the imposition of a third poll tax within 4 years, designed to raise funds for the war against France. Unlike previous taxes, the poll tax was a flat levy, meaning that every adult, regardless of wealth, had to pay the same amount. This regressive nature of the tax made it especially burdensome for the poor. When government agents attempted to enforce collection rigorously, they provoked widespread anger and resistance, particularly in the southeastern counties of Kent and Essex. However, the anger over the poll tax was only the surface of much deeper economic discontent. The roots of economic frustration lay in the cumulative impact of decades of economic policies and crises. The Black Death of 1348 to 1350 had decimated England's population, killing between 1/3 and 1/2 of its inhabitants. This demographic catastrophe had profound economic consequences, including a severe labor shortage that led to increased wages. The peasants, who had been bound to the land through feudal obligations, now saw an opportunity to negotiate better terms with their landlords or move to other areas offering higher wages. This newly acquired leverage, however, was met with resistance from the ruling elite. In response, laws like the Statute of Labourers of 1351 were enacted to keep wages at pre-Black Death levels and restrict the movement of workers. These statutes were vigorously enforced, with local justices being given wide-ranging powers to impose fines and other penalties on those who violated wage limits. Records from local courts show a considerable number of prosecutions under these laws, particularly in areas like East Anglia and the Midlands, where tensions were already high. The legislation was deeply resented, as it appeared to deny the peasants the natural benefits of a reduced labor force. The attempt to enforce pre-plague economic conditions in a post-plague world fostered a sense of injustice and frustration among the peasantry, who viewed these laws as an affront to their hard-won gains in the labor market. Furthermore, the period saw a gradual shift from traditional feudal dues, like labor services, to cash rents. While this change might seem beneficial, as it provided a more flexible form of tenure, it also exposed peasants to new forms of economic vulnerability. Peasants who could not afford these cash payments often fell into debt, and local records reveal a growing number of cases where peasants lost their lands or goods due to unpaid rents. Lords, seeking to maximize income, became increasingly harsh in their collection of rents and other dues. In some regions, they attempted to reimpose labor services or claim other traditional rights that had fallen into disuse, leading to bitter disputes and confrontations. In Kent and Essex, where the revolt began, the situation was further aggravated by the enforcement of villenage, or hereditary servitude tied to the land. Many lords, faced with rising labor costs, sought to tighten control over their villeins, enforcing old obligations or imposing new restrictions. The renewed efforts to enforce villenage sparked widespread anger, as many peasants believed they were entitled to freedom based on the evolving economic conditions and the perceived promise of ancient liberties. The intensity of resistance varied by region, but the southeast, with its strong tradition of local independence and relatively large numbers of free peasants, proved to be particularly volatile. By the late 1370s, a significant portion of the peasant population felt squeezed by economic changes that promised freedom but instead delivered new forms of exploitation. Political discontent and the failure of governance. Economic grievances were intertwined with a growing sense of political discontent and frustration with the ruling elite. The late 14th century was a period of intense political instability in England. The young King Richard II, who ascended to the throne in 1377, was surrounded by a coterie of unpopular advisers, including his uncle John of Gaunt. This ruling circle was widely perceived as corrupt and self-serving, accused of mismanaging the war with France, imposing heavy taxes, and enriching themselves at the expense of the common people. The resentment was not confined to the upper echelons of power. Many peasants and townsfolk resented the erosion of local autonomy and the increasing intrusion of royal officials into their lives. The frequent imposition of special commissions to enforce tax collection, such as the poll tax, was seen as a direct attack on traditional local rights and privileges. In many instances, these officials acted in arbitrary and oppressive ways, using their positions to extract bribes, impose fines, and enrich themselves. The chronic abuses of power by local and royal officials generated a profound sense of betrayal among the populace. Moreover, the peasantry felt that the royal government had failed to fulfill its fundamental obligations to protect and provide justice for its subjects. The ongoing and costly Hundred Years' War against France drained England's resources and led to repeated demands for taxation. Yet, many perceived the war as a series of costly failures that benefited only a narrow elite. Additionally, there was widespread dissatisfaction with the judicial system, which seemed biased in favor of the wealthy and powerful. Royal courts were seen as denying justice to common people in their dealings with landlords, merchants, and other elites, exacerbating a sense of alienation and resentment. The role of radical clerics like John Bull cannot be underestimated in shaping the political dimensions of the revolt. Bull, a priest who had been excommunicated and imprisoned multiple times for his inflammatory sermons, was a vocal critic of the social and political order. He preached a proto-socialist message, calling for the overthrow of the existing hierarchy and the establishment of a more egalitarian society. His famous rhetorical question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" resonated with many who saw the existing social hierarchy as fundamentally unjust. Bull's sermons, circulated through secret networks, helped to articulate a coherent ideological framework for the revolt, transforming it from a series of local protests into a broader movement with social and political goals. Local instances of unrest before 1381 further illustrate the growing political discontent. In 1377, there were reports of disturbances in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire over the imposition of new taxes, and in the same year, anti-clerical riots broke out in London, reflecting a general frustration with both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. These earlier protests served as precursors to the larger uprising in 1381, providing a foundation of resistance and a network of communication that would prove critical once the revolt began in earnest. The failure of governance also extended to Richard II's response to the immediate outbreak of the revolt. The government's attempts to enforce the poll tax, for example, were marked by inconsistencies and heavy-handed tactics that only served to inflame tensions. The Royal Council's decision to deploy commissioners to investigate tax evasion led to violent confrontations in Kent and Essex, where local communities resisted what they saw as the unjust imposition of a flawed tax system. The government's inability to anticipate the scale of resistance and its failure to respond effectively to early signs of discontent revealed a profound disconnect between the ruling elite and the common people. Social change and the decline of feudalism. The economic and political grievances that fueled the peasant revolt were closely linked to broader social changes taking place in late medieval England. One of the most significant of these changes was the gradual decline of the feudal system. By the late 14th century, the rigid social hierarchies that had characterized medieval society for centuries were beginning to break down. The Black Death had created a labor shortage that allowed many peasants to improve their social and economic positions. Some were able to negotiate better terms with their landlords, purchase their own land, or move to towns and cities in search of better opportunities. The demographic and economic changes of the 14th century thus led to a growing sense of social mobility and aspiration among the lower classes. This shift was particularly noticeable among free peasants or yeomen, who were no longer bound to the land and had some degree of economic independence. These individuals were often more educated and politically aware than their forebears and increasingly willing to challenge the social status quo. For instance, court records from the period reveal numerous instances of peasants bringing lawsuits against their landlords, challenging unfair practices or seeking to protect their newly acquired freedoms. The decline of traditional feudal relations also reshaped rural communities. Many villages were transitioning from tightly controlled feudal estates to more loosely organized communities of independent or semi-independent tenants. This shift created new tensions, as those who had gained some degree of independence resented continued attempts by landlords to enforce old feudal obligations. At the same time, those who remained tied to the land as serfs or villeins saw the opportunities available to their free counterparts and grew more dissatisfied with their lack of freedom. Urban centers played a critical role in fostering this discontent and nurturing a sense of collective action. Many leaders of the peasant revolt, including Wat Tyler, had connections to towns and cities where ideas about freedom, rights, and resistance to authority were more openly discussed. The urban environment, especially in London, provided fertile ground for revolutionary ideas to spread. Londoners were particularly discontented with the heavy-handed rule of city authorities and the corruption of the royal government. The rebels marched to London and their occupation of the city were significant acts, reflecting both the symbolic and practical importance of the capital in the revolt strategy. The broader social changes of the period thus contributed to a heightened sense of injustice and dissatisfaction with the status quo. The lower classes, who were beginning to perceive themselves as entitled to certain rights and freedoms, were no longer willing to accept their traditional place in society. They began to demand a greater say in governance and a fairer distribution of resources and opportunities. These demands, while not always articulated in clear or consistent terms, reflected a deepening consciousness of social inequality and a willingness to challenge the existing order. Revolutionary ideology or pragmatic rebellion. Historians have long debated whether the peasant revolt of 1381 was driven by a coherent revolutionary ideology or whether it was a more pragmatic response to immediate grievances. Some scholars, particularly those writing in the 19th and early 20th centuries, saw the revolt as an early expression of class consciousness and a precursor to later revolutionary movements. They pointed to the radical rhetoric of leaders like John Ball and the rebels' demands for the abolition of serfdom, the reduction of taxes, and the end of the privileges of the nobility and clergy as evidence of a nascent revolutionary ideology. More recent historians, however, have argued that the revolt was less ideologically driven and more a pragmatic response to specific grievances. They suggest that the rebels' demands were shaped primarily by their immediate circumstances and that their actions were motivated by a desire for justice and redress rather than by any grand revolutionary vision. For example, while the rebels demanded the abolition of serfdom, this was often framed in terms of the restoration of ancient liberties rather than the creation of a new social order. Similarly, their calls for the removal of evil counsellors from the king's government were rooted in a traditional belief in the king's responsibility to govern justly, rather than a rejection of monarchy itself. Comparing the Peasant Revolt of 1381 with other contemporary uprisings, such as the Jacquerie in France, 1358, and the Ciompi Revolt in Florence, 1378, reveals both similarities and differences that can help contextualize the English revolt. Like the English rebels, the French peasants rose against what they perceived as exploitation by the nobility, fueled by economic hardship and political failures. However, the Jacquerie was characterized by extreme violence and lacked a coherent program beyond immediate destruction. In contrast, the English revolt was more organized, with articulated demands and specific targets, suggesting a more developed political consciousness. The Ciompi Revolt in Florence, involving lower urban classes demanding a greater share of political power and economic justice, shares more similarities with the Peasant Revolt in England. Both involved organized movements that sought to reform existing systems rather than overthrow them entirely. However, the English revolt had a broader base, encompassing both rural and urban elements, and was driven by a combination of economic, social, and political grievances that reflected the unique conditions of late medieval England. While the Peasant Revolt of 1381 may not have been revolutionary in the modern sense, it clearly represented a significant challenge to the existing social and political order. The rebels' willingness to march on London, attack royal officials, and execute unpopular figures like Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Robert Hales, the treasurer, demonstrated a level of organization and determination that went far beyond mere spontaneous protest. The uprising's rapid spread across southern and eastern England suggests a level of coordination and communication that implies a degree of ideological coherence, even if this was not always fully articulated. The role of leadership and local dynamics. The success of the Peasant Revolt in 1381 can also be attributed to effective leadership and the specific local dynamics that shaped the course of the rebellion. Wat Tyler, who emerged as the leader of the Kentish rebels, played a crucial role in organizing and directing the revolt. Tyler's leadership was characterized by charisma, tactical acumen, and an ability to articulate the grievances of the common people. His demands for the end of serfdom, the abolition of feudal services, and the removal of corrupt officials resonated deeply with a discontented populace, allowing him to galvanize support quickly. Local dynamics also played a critical role in the uprising. The counties of Kent and Essex, where the revolt began, had long been areas of tension and resistance to seigneurial control. In these regions, many peasants had already experienced a degree of autonomy and freedom from manorial obligations, and there was a strong tradition of local resistance to external authority. When government officials attempted to enforce the unpopular poll tax, they encountered fierce resistance from communities already resentful of outside interference. The arrest of village leaders by royal agents was often the spark that ignited rebellion in these areas, as local communities rallied to defend their autonomy and protest against what they saw as unjust and oppressive measures. The revolt spread to other areas, such as East Anglia, the Midlands, and the Thames Valley, further highlights the role of local dynamics. In East Anglia, for example, the revolt was fueled by long-standing grievances against the practices of local landlords and the corruption of royal officials. The rebellion there took on a particularly violent character, with attacks on manorial records and the destruction of property, reflecting a deep-seated anger at the local manifestations of feudal control. In the Midlands, the rebellion intersected with pre-existing tensions between townspeople and local elites, demonstrating the ways in which local grievances could feed into a broader movement of revolt. Conclusion: the real reason for the Peasant Revolt of 1381. The Peasant Revolt of 1381 was not merely the result of a single tax or a sudden outburst of anger. It was a complex and multifaceted movement rooted in a wide array of economic, political, and social factors. The revolt was sparked by immediate grievances, such as the imposition of the poll tax and the arbitrary actions of royal officials, but these were only the final straws that broke the camel's back. Beneath the surface, the rebellion was fueled by deeper structural changes, including the economic hardships imposed by the Black Death, the social tensions arising from the decline of feudalism, and the political dissatisfaction with the governance of King Richard II's regime. While the revolt did not achieve all its aims and was ultimately suppressed, it left a lasting legacy. The uprising forced the ruling elite to reconsider their policies and contributed to the gradual erosion of feudal structures in England. It also highlighted the growing assertiveness of the lower classes and their willingness to challenge the established social and political order. As such, the Peasant Revolt of 1381 can be seen as a pivotal moment in the long-term development of English society, one that reflected the complex interplay of economic forces, political tensions, and social changes that characterized the late medieval period. The long-term effects of the revolt were profound, influencing future conflicts and reforms. The revolt demonstrated the potential power of the lower classes to force change, a lesson that would be remembered in subsequent centuries during events such as the Wars of the Roses and the English Reformation. The revolt also contributed to a gradual shift in the relationship between the monarchy and its subjects, highlighting the need for a more responsive and just governance. In the broader evolution of social and political thought in late medieval and early modern England, the Peasant Revolt helped lay the groundwork for future debates about authority, rights, and justice. In conclusion, the real reason for the Peasant Revolt of 1381 was not a single cause, but a combination of factors that had been building for decades. It was a movement that, while not revolutionary in the modern sense, nevertheless represented a significant challenge to the established order and paved the way for the profound transformations that would shape England in the centuries to come. Thanks for listening. Like and comment. And please subscribe, as that will help us get more videos out to those interested in the Middle Ages. See you next time on Medieval Chronicles 1066. Stay curious.